InFi, episode 31.
Welcome to InFi, the future of finance, hosted by American economist and author Dr. Robert Murphy. Each week, tune in for dynamic discussions with business pioneers about emerging trends in finance, life insurance, asset management, technology, and more. Now, let's talk the future of finance.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the InFi podcast. This episode, we're going to be rebroadcasting a lecture I gave recently. It was on March 27th, 2024, if you're keeping track, at Oklahoma State University. So the context is the Free Enterprise Society, which is a student group down there. They had me down there to give a series of nighttime lectures on various topics. But since I was going, one of the professors who has an entrepreneurship class said, hey, let's get this Murphy guy to come and give a talk to my class. So we managed to make that work. And it just so happened that it dovetailed very nicely with the other lectures I was giving on this trip to integrate it into the stuff we're doing here at Infineo. And so I will explain, you'll hear in a minute when I turn the reins over to my past self, I guess, and we get into the talk, that I'll give the full backstory, so I don't need to repeat it here. But the big picture is that a lot of the private market solutions to standard public problems or social problems that traditionally people think the state needs to solve, we libertarian economists have for decades been explaining, oh, no, you can use the market to solve it. But there's certain technological innovations that now make those private sector solutions a lot more practical than they used to be. And so I realized a lot of the stuff we're doing here at Infineo actually intersects with some of my earlier work when I was in academia. And that's what this talk is going to be talking about. One last bit of housekeeping. The audio may be coming and going a little bit. It's not too bad, but what's happening, in case you're just listening to the audio and you're not watching the video, is they had two mics on me, and one was amplifying my voice for the students in the lecture room, and then another one was in my breast pocket for, the online post, which is what we're using here for this audio. And so if I was turning my head to point to my PowerPoint and to read something, it might sound like my voice went far away. Okay, so that's kind of hard to adjust. But anyway, if you hear the audio coming and going, that's what's going on there. Last thing I'll say is, as I just alluded to, there is a PowerPoint. So if you want, you might want to check out the video version of this episode to see the accompanying PowerPoint slides. But either way, it'll be fine. You'll understand what's going on if you just listen to the audio. So here we go. This is the talk I gave recently to an entrepreneurship class at Oklahoma State University. Well, thanks everybody for the showing up, and hopefully this will be an enjoyable talk for you. I just want to clarify, I know that the blue font there is a little bit hard to read. So my current position is at the company, just to spell that out, in case anything that I say, intrigues you and you want to go see more about some of the things I'm going to cover here. So it's infineo.ai. Infineo.ai is the name of the company. And just to give a little bit of background to explain what I'm going to do in this talk and the connection, I see a lot of familiar faces. So I know some of you were at the talk last night. So I originally was an academic economist. I taught at Hillsdale College in Michigan, and then I spent several years at Texas Tech at what's called the Free Market Institute there as an economist. And so my career basically has focused on, voluntary market provision of services that traditionally are things that the state would provide. And I don't, just to make sure I'm not losing it, when I say the state in this talk, I don't mean like Oklahoma or California or Texas. I mean like the political institution. That's what I mean by the state, not just, a particular state, but state like with a capital S, as if you've heard it used in that way. So that's historically what I focused on in terms of my work, both, academic journal articles and, historical case studies, things like that, talking to other economists and public policy people. But also I did a lot in terms of trying to explain to the layperson, like with both books and then just talks like this or in other forums about, hey, we could imagine the way that, how could a market provide things like military defense or police services or, build the roads, that kind of stuff. So that's what a lot of my work was involved with. And then I left academia several years ago, and I ended up in the financial sector. And a lot of what I do, so my current role is with this company, Infineo, where I'm the chief economist. And we do a lot of stuff that is using blockchain technology. And also we specialize in life insurance right now, but we're broadening it to do other kinds of insurance. And so what I've realized is, even though in a sense, those two aspects of my career intrinsically had nothing to do with each other, it was just, I went into this sector and that was something consulting I had done. And then these guys hired me because I had expertise in the type of life insurance they use. I realized the more we got into it that, oh, wow, a lot of the stuff that I used to talk about sort of in the abstract and was like fanciful, that back when I was in grad school, just saying, oh, we could imagine a market could do X, Y, Z, but the practical implementation of those solutions might have seemed a little far-fetched 20 years ago when I first started writing on this stuff. But I realized more and more that the tools we're building, like at infineo, and then there's other companies that are in this space too, that it makes the solution of a lot of the stuff that I talked about more hypothetically earlier in my career, it makes it a lot easier to actually go ahead and do. And so this is no longer like, science fiction, but is stuff that actually could be implemented if the, regulations allowed for it and certain companies got interested. So there's just kind of the backdrop to what I'm going to be going through today. Also, let me, I guess, apologize for those of you who did come last night and saw that talk. There's going to be a little bit of repetition because basically what I'm going to do is some of the points that I went through pretty quickly last night. In today's talk, I'm going to try to flesh those out and show you more pragmatically, like how could a company actually do the kind of thing that last night I just maybe made offhand reference and moved on. Okay, so but since I have to do that, I can't leave people here behind. So for people who weren't here last night, I kind of have to give the context of what I've been talking about. So for some of you, a little bit, but not too much of what I do today is going to be a little bit of repetition. Okay, so we're just to get us going here so you can see what I mean. A real obvious example, something that already has happened, it's a done deal, is the use of smartphones in solving a problem that free market-oriented economists have been complaining about for a long time. And specifically, it had to do with taxi cab regulation. And so I don't know if you're aware of this, but in major cities, typically the way it works is you have to have, it's like a medallion system. At least that's how it was in New York City. That's the system that a lot of economists studied. And so the idea was that you need a taxi for a major city like New York. You got to have taxis, otherwise it's not going to work. People living there and visiting for business and whatever. But you just can't have anybody doing that. You need to regulate it, right? And so that they had a very special type of car. It was painted a certain way so everyone could tell that's a cab and not just that's a random civilian car, as it were. And then, of course, they vetted, who was allowed to drive those things. They wanted to make sure only qualified people could be driving it. You don't want to hop into a cab and the person kidnaps you or drives to a dangerous neighborhood and then robs you, right? And so that was the rationale and justification for the regulation. But then what happened in practice was originally, it wasn't that hard to get a medallion. So when I say medallion, what I mean is historically, it was like a thing that was hanging from the rear view mirror that signified that, yes, the government has approved me. I am part of this group that is allowed to legally pick up passengers for fares. I could be a cab driver in New York City. And over time, and you were allowed to sell that to somebody else. Or like if you wanted to retire or just something happened and you wanted to get out of the business, or you died or something. And so those things became very valuable, worth tens of thousands of dollars, because it was very lucrative to get into that business. Because if the government caught somebody else, driving people around for money, you were breaking the law. You get in trouble for that. But also it was hard to coordinate. And so certainly you could not have a yellow looking car like that and not be regulated and just be driving around, even though you weren't a medallion holder. You would definitely get in trouble for doing that. And that's how they sort of maintained their, I guess you'd call it a cartel. And that meant that fares were a lot higher than they otherwise would have been, right? That's why business people want to restrict supply to put a push out competitors, is so that they can charge more, right? And so economists for decades had been complaining about this system and talking about how, hey, it would be a lot more efficient, lower prices, better quality. Because the other thing too was there was a period in the heyday the cabs were not very clean, right? You'd hop into a cab and there would, somebody had spilled soda or whatever, and it would just all be sticky seats, or maybe somebody threw up because they were drinking the night before. The cab could be gross besides being what seemed to be very expensive for, just taking me 13 blocks down the street. That seems kind of crazy how much you're charging me. Okay, so that's the system. An economist wrote for a long time about that, but nothing really happened. Okay, because it didn't seem very practical. And also, it's hard, once a system like that is locked in place, and, so if you become a new cab driver and you pay somebody, whatever, $50,000 to get the medallion, you're not going to want regulations that allow that to be open to competition, because then your investment falls away, right? So those were some of the constraints. In the general public, it seemed real academic, and what do I care? So of course, you probably saw where I was going with this. What completely devastated that system was the rise of Uber. And Uber is only possible if a lot of people have smartphones. Otherwise, it just doesn't work. Okay, so this is an example of the kind of thing I mean. So this is what I'm trying to get across in this talk, that I'm going to speak about things that market-oriented economists have for a long time been writing about. Oh, the way this system right now that's monopolized by or heavily regulated by the government works, it's very inefficient, and we free market economists can see that. It's so obvious to us, but it's kind of hard to get the general public to see it, because if you're not a trained economist, you're not used to thinking like that. You just don't see that kind of stuff, doesn't jump out at you. It's not as tangible. And then if you can't get the public to support it, clearly the people running the system and who are profiting from the way it is right now and the status quo aren't going to change it. Why would they? All right. So the benefit of this approach, what Uber, and then Lyft and their copycats showed, is that if you could just come up with a way technologically to get around the existing system, then you can go ahead and do that. And then once the public sees the actual alternative, they might be in favor of the newcomers. Okay, so historically what happened with Uber is they didn't originally, go to all the different city councils or whoever the relevant bodies were and petition them and say, hey, can we please get your blessing to start doing this in your city? They just went and did it. And then, it was like rather to ask for forgiveness than permission. Like that was kind of the motto. And so they just went ahead and did it. And then by the time the cab drivers and whatever organized support to go say, hey, you got to shut them down, the public saw the difference that, oh, wow, in general, the Uber rides were a lot cheaper. The cars were cleaner and so forth, nicer vehicles. And just they're all sort of, and plus to the benefits, like to be able to see, like back in the day, if you had to go somewhere, you wanted to call a cab, that you would call them on the phone, the central dispatch, and they would say, what's your address? Okay, yeah, we'll have a cab there and whatever. Okay, yeah, I got some guys, they'll be there at 2 o'clock. And 2 o'clock could come and go, and you had no idea. Whereas now, obviously, being able to track stuff on the phone and see how far away is the Uber ride, it makes it just so much more convenient. So I'm saying without smartphones, this really wouldn't have worked. And to be able to rate your driver real effortlessly after the fact and whatever, so that if there is somebody in the Uber framework who really is a bad driver, like he's reckless or he swears at the customers, or you get in and the car reeks of cigarette smoke, like Uber has a framework that gets penalized very quickly. Whereas with the old conventional cab approach, it's like if you got into a cab and it was bad, yeah, you could call a number, but nothing's going to happen. They don't care. What are they going to do? So whereas I'm saying Uber, because it's running a business and they have competitors, they do take that seriously if somebody complains. Okay, so I'm just saying that whole framework. And then once the public saw that, and then they realized, oh, wait, there's a move afoot that the cab drivers are trying to get the government to ban Uber in our city, there was more of an outcry, because the cab driver saying, oh, this is unregulated and there could be an axe murderer driving around. Everyone knew that was crazy. No, the reason they're complaining is they're losing business and they're getting undercut by cheaper competition. And so that's what I'm saying, that the case of Uber really demonstrates that dynamic well. Okay, so since I'm talking about cars, let me just mention, this is another example of like a common everyday problem, maybe not so much, for you guys here or in Oklahoma generally, but certainly in major urban areas where day in and day out, certain times of the day, certain roads are just unusable, right? They have massive traffic jams, call rush hour. Okay, and a lot of people, I think, believe that, oh, that's just the way the world is. And yep, if you're going to have roads, certainly in crowded areas, sometimes a day, that's just going to be bumper to bumper like that. And most, free market economists who have studied this topic would say, no, that's not an example of just that's how roads are. What that's showing you is that's what a shortage looks like. That's a road that is priced too cheaply. That's an example of a price being too low. So how you guys, do you know what I mean by if I say a shortage? And like you guys, okay, enough of you have taken, I'm not going to go ahead and put it on the board here because we've got a lot to go through. But, there's a supply and demand curves and they intersect at a point. And if the price is lower than that, then there's a shortage in the gap because the quantity demanded is higher than the quantity supplied. Okay, so that standard framework that normally you think of in terms of bottles of water after a hurricane or something also can be applied here. And it's especially poignant when there are tolls for these roads, right? So in major cities like New York, for example, people driving from Long Island into the city to work every day, they pay tolls to use the roads. And the point is the toll is too low. Given everything else in the situation, the toll is clearly too low because too many people are trying to use the road at the same time. And that's not good for anybody. And so the standard economist explanation or solution to this would be to say, you should have prices that more accurately reflect the conditions, what can be called dynamic pricing. And then you don't stop the analysis there, right? Because it's true if you just kept the existing infrastructure, like the bridges and the roads and whatever, and then just said, okay, let's allow for higher prices at peak times, then that might reduce the congestion. But, then, that's harder for people that don't have as much money to be able to travel and so on. Even there, it's arguably still helping the community as a whole, because if they're making the same amount of total profit, it could be that, the higher prices during peak hours can allow for lower prices at other times. And so it just means people who are a bit flexible in their driving, they can just postpone, right? So somebody who, I have to go into the city, but I don't need to go at 9 a.m., they might just wait an hour, right? And so then those types of people aren't competing with the people that have to get to work. So that's kind of the logic of it. But more generally, the idea is if it were totally privatized, like the provision of roads, and so what, right now, instead of thinking that, that's something the government takes care of, who builds the roads? Oh, the government does. That's kind of what a lot of people think of as a standard thing that the government needs to do. But the idea is, well, no, if it was private businesses doing it and they had the rights to do that, then yes, right overnight, if the government just privatized everything and sold the roads to private companies to charge whatever you want, a lot of people say, geez, that sounds kind of reckless. Wouldn't they just charge sky-high prices during rush hour? And they might, but then what would that do? If there was high prices and profits, then that would be an incentive for other companies to come in or the same company to build more capacity. Okay, so just in general, you don't want the government running agriculture or the computer industry or the car industry. You wouldn't want to have a bunch of politicians deciding how many different cars should be made each year, or how many different models and things like that. Most people agree, central planning, like in the old Soviet Union model, that doesn't work. That leads to higher prices, less quality for consumers, less variety, and so forth. And so I'm saying that logic even applies to something like roads. It's just normally we don't think of that because it seems kind of like a logistical difficulty. But I'm saying the use of things like smartphones or having transponders on cars makes this a lot more practical than it would have been 40 years ago when certain economists were writing on, hey, shouldn't private business own the roads? Because back then it was hard to say, well, how are they going to pay for it? Are we going to have every mile? Is there going to be a toll bridge to stop people and have them pull over and put quarters into a machine? Whereas now, just with, like I say, toll easy pass tags and things that we all have now in the government system, that would be very easy, that you don't even need to stop. You just keep driving and the thing just keeps track of, oh, you went through at this time of day, so therefore, your account gets billed this much. Okay, so just another example of how technology makes a lot of this stuff more practical than it used to be. And by the way, this isn't complete science fiction either. That there are already has happened, like in Chicago, certain parts of the toll road systems have been privatized, where the city government realized they could make more money by selling it to an outside company rather than them running it themselves and earning the toll revenue. But even there, so I think that's a better system than what they were doing. But there still were a lot of constraints built in, where the government of the city of Chicago still maintained a lot of discretionary power over, well, this is how many roads could be built. And so, whereas again, if it were more open-ended, then I think you would see a lot more innovation. Okay, just a few more points on this. So to give you some of the history, the first roads in the U.S., they're called turnpikes. They actually were privately financed and maintained, and it was only later that the government got involved, right? So here, it's not that I'm recommending some brand new thing. It actually originally, the first groups that built actual, systematic roads were private organizations, and it was only later the government kind of came in and muscled out the competition. In this realm too, the experimentation and lack of uniformity is actually a good thing. Okay, so one of the objections to, if somebody like me is talking about, hey, why don't we let private business run the roads and there wouldn't be as many traffic jams and there'd be more options and this and that, and the potholes wouldn't be as bad, because that's another element too, right? That in a lot of places, I don't know if the roads around here are good, but there's a lot of areas in the U.S. where the roads are just like the lunar surface, right? You have to just drive around major potholes. You can really screw up your car depending on what kind of roads you drive on. And so, yes, in principle, the government's supposed to fix those and they have a budget and blah, blah, blah. But it's not like if they don't fix that road, the mayor's going to not be reelected, right? There's so many other things that the local government is supposed to be taking care of, that fixing the road on 14th Street, fixing the potholes there, that's not going to make or break somebody's political career. Whereas if it's a business and there's different businesses that own competing roads and there's two different ways to get from here to there, well, then now they're in competition. So if one road is riddled with potholes and the other one is a nice smooth drive, more people are going to use that one. Okay, so again, just simple competition. That logic applies even to roads. But like I say, one of the objections to that, people could concede, yeah, sure, in general, competition is a good thing. But geez, with roads, like, don't we need to have a sort of uniformity? Like, you wouldn't want to have all kinds of different rules depending on which company ran which road or whatever. And so, yeah, yes and no. That, right, you wouldn't want it to be that some companies have a red light meaning stop and other companies have a red light meaning go. Like, that would probably be confusing and a bad idea. But notice, you have coordination with companies on all kinds of stuff all the time, like electrical ratings and things like that. Or, there's all kinds of uniformity, weights and measures and things where there's a lot of compatibility. Look, screws and screwdrivers work together, okay? And it's not because there has to be a law saying that. It's just the companies all realize if we adhere to common units of measurement and so forth and standards, then our products will all work with each other, okay? So I think stuff like, what do the traffic signs mean? There would be reason that you would expect uniformity in that. But having said that, it's actually, you don't want to just be locked into one framework, because what if it's not a great system? So for example, I saw a video, I don't know if you guys have ever seen something like this. There was this, I think he was in Denmark, and it was a road engineer, and he had some pretty, avant-garde opinions. And in his view, if you needed like signs, like especially like stop signs, or if you needed lights, to him, that was a signal that the road designers were lazy and they were like cheating, right? That he thought, no, a good road design, just by the nature of how the road goes and the traffic flows, it should force the drivers to pay attention and to do the right thing to avoid accidents. And so in his view, if you're designing a road and you have to use a stop sign in order to get the people to stop, then that's a signal that you're doing something wrong. And so what he ended up, his own designs, so there was like a city, I forget which one, where they really let this guy go loose on certain intersections and things, and he redesigned it. And so basically he had traffic circles. If you've seen those, they do have them in the US, but they're more popular in certain places like in Europe and South America. Okay, so it's, the cars, it's, is there, yeah, I'm sure you guys have seen, but, it's coming up and then there's a thing like this. And so it goes like that. And you can keep going, or you can go off, and you can go up and you can go this way, and you can keep going around, you can go that way, right? So the cars are coming this way and you can go this way. If you wanted to just keep going straight, you end up kind of going around this thing and you go like that. If you wanted to go that way, you go around and go like that. But the point is, the traffic just keeps flowing, and there's not like a red light and these cars all stop and then let these guys go this way, and then that turns red, and then these guys, it doesn't do that. Things just flow the whole time. And so there was a video where he wanted. So his point was he doesn't like the interstate system, like the way it's in the U.S., because he said that lulls people into a false sense of security. If you're driving and in a normal like interstate kind of thing where there's no, or even if on a major road, but there's traffic lights, you kind of just zone out and you don't pay attention. And so because you're like, oh no, if I'm supposed to stop, the light will be red and then I'll stop. Otherwise, you're playing with your phone, you're texting somebody, or you're fiddling with the radio, wherever you're doing, but you're not paying attention. Whereas a system like this, if you've never experienced this, if you're driving and you come up to a traffic circle and you see cars coming and go, you really slow down and you pay attention because it's disorienting to you as a driver. You're out of your comfort zones, right? So that was his theory. And then to illustrate that, so he was with a camera crew for a system he had designed, and he was like standing here, and pedestrians could walk, across and get to here, and then keep going. And so he had a camera crew, and he actually, to demonstrate how safe his system was, he just said, "Watch this." And the cars. And he just turned around backwards and just walked out into the road. So he died. It was a joke. He didn't die. The cars stopped. The point was the cars all swerved around. So he wasn't supposed to do that, but nobody hit him. And his point was, because my system doesn't rely on crosswalks and a pedestrian, walk, don't walk. It was just the drivers are all paying attention when they're going around this thing because it's disorienting. All right. So my point is, going back to this bullet point, that the fact that, if we had competition, maybe different companies would try radically different approaches and they would do different. That's what you want, actually. Okay. Because how do we know that right now the way we do roads in the US is a good system? We don't actually know that. And so having it open up to competition is the way you would find that out. And so if one company in some city somewhere tried some novel approach where, we don't use stop signs here, we just use roundabouts or traffic circles, and maybe that would be good, or maybe it wouldn't. Maybe there would be more pedestrian fatalities, and so then other people would know, let's not do that, okay? I think Walter Block came here recently. He's written a lot on this. You can Google his name in private roads if you want to see like a whole book-length treatment of this. And, I'm going through these topics really fast, but he's written a whole book on this stuff, drawing on empirical literature if you wanted to see more about it. But one of his points that he makes is to say, he cites the statistics for how many Americans die in traffic accidents each year. And whenever that happens, the government just blames, the person was drinking or the person didn't have their brakes checked or whatever. But his point is, if it were a private business or industry that was responsible for that many fatalities of people using their product or service each year, there'd be congressional investigations. But since it's the roads and people die using the roads, then, let's just say it's the driver error. Okay, so again, a lot of stuff that we just sort of take for granted. I think if they privatize the roads, not only would you not have to deal with traffic jams as much, that that would be more of an aberration rather than just a daily occurrence, that I think a lot fewer people would die in car accidents. One other quick one on this, just as I'm speaking about transportation. So again, I don't know if you guys have experienced this yourselves, but if you ever are in a major city and you're taking like a subway or a train, I experienced this. So I went to NYU for grad school, and that's New York University. And so there were certain train like subway lines that at certain times of day, you just knew it would look like that, right? That it would, the train would pull up, people would be on the platform waiting to get on, the doors would open, and people would jam in. I'm not exaggerating. Like you were like this, and then the door until the doors, and the guy would have to like pull his coat in to make sure the door could close. And you would be just jammed like that for the next 5 stops until enough people started getting off and you could breathe again. Okay. And again, I think the people, the New Yorkers there, if I had asked them like, hey, doesn't this seem like a crazy system? And they could say, well, there's a lot of people who live in the city. What do you expect? And they just think that that's normal. When my point is, no, that's not how transportation is. That's how government underpriced transportation is. That you can, there's a lot of demand for a movie on opening night, some blockbuster movie on opening night. And what do? It's not that they sell so many tickets that in the theater, people are sitting on your lap and that there's people in front of you all jammed like this to watch the movie. No, they sell enough tickets so that everyone in the show has a very comfortable experience. And the same thing with planes that are privately owned. That, if there's a very popular tourist destination, tickets might be expensive. and they, or they might sell out when you go, oh, gee, I couldn't get a flight. Or I went to look and geez, it was $1,200. There's no way I'm paying that for that flight. So that's the way the market works. But if you do get a ticket and get on the plane, you're not jammed in there like this. And again, this is common sense stuff, but why do they do that? Because they want their customers to have a good experience. So again, I'm just highlighting over and over in this talk the difference between when a good or a service is provided by private, voluntary business, where the customers, if they don't have a good time, they can take their business elsewhere. They don't have to pay it. There's just a vast difference in the incentives there. Whereas with this isn't actually a subway, that's just a Groucho Marx thing, but that is the experience. Whereas the people running the subways in New York, yes, in a vague sense, the mayor of New York would like it so that people don't get jammed into subways every rush hour. But again, the mayor's election is not going to hinge on how people felt on the subway during rush hour. And so in terms of the incentives, the structure is not the same. Okay, so now let me move on. So there I talked about some more pedestrian things, no pun intended, but let me now move on to things that are a bit more fanciful, but I think have the potential to have a greater impact on humanity. So talk about safety regulations, things relevant in the news. May have just happened like a day or two ago. In Baltimore, a cargo ship hit the bridge, and Francis Scott Key Bridge, and it collapsed it. I think they're saying at least several people have died, and they're investigating that. You may be hearing that on certain Boeing planes, the doors have been flying off in the middle of a flight, which is not ideal. And then also in general, what do we do right now in the U.S. to ensure or to try to ensure food and drug safety? Oh, we've got the FDA. Okay. And so what's funny is a lot of the news stories about this particular situation, they were talking about how that cargo ship, it failed a recent inspection over in, I think it was in Chile or something. And so all these things, it's like government agencies are in charge of maintaining the reliability and safety of shipping lines. And so at some point, there was a safety inspection that, geez, they failed. And then they said they let them go ahead and operate anyway. And then now the question is, should they have done that? And Okay. And the same thing with Boeing. There's the FAA in the U.S., Federal Aviation Administration, whose job it is to ensure that the planes that fly in U.S. airspace are safe. Okay. So anytime something like this happens, strictly speaking, it's a failure of the state-provided safety regulation. And so then the question is just, what could the market do better? Okay, so what's weird about this is anytime there is a problem like that, even if there's an investigation and it's determined that the government, regulatory body that was ostensibly in charge of this or had jurisdiction over this event, even if it's determined that they didn't live up to their own standards, usually the call is not for the people involved to get fired and for that agency to lose funding. All right, so I can give you a specific example. When I was in high school, there was a plane crash in the Everglades in Florida. The company at the time was called Value Jet, and then it was such a PR scandal that they changed the name of their company after. And it was determined, a lot of people died, okay? And so there was an investigation, and it was determined, I don't remember the exact details, but it was like they looked at the safety logs and everything, and the checkups on that particular plane were not what they should have been, okay? And so, after this crash happens and there's an investigation, what caused, they realized that yes, the FAA inspection schedule or whatever, according to the codes, was not done properly for this particular plane, and there was some kind of mechanical problem, and that's why it crashed. All right, and so what happened in the wake of that? Were there a bunch of people in Congress demanding the FAA's budget get cut 20%? No, it was the exact opposite. That there were people saying the FAA is underfunded. They need to hire more staff, right? Because they can't do their job properly. You had people, they didn't even do the proper inspections on this plane. And so clearly we need a bigger budget to be able to hire more people, to have more out in the field so that this doesn't happen again. Okay, so you see the perverse incentives there. So to be clear, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying the people at the FAA that morning woke up and twirled their mustaches and said, I know, let's have a plane crash so we can get a bigger budget. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying the logic of the system in terms of they got a lot going on. There's thousands of planes coming and going or whatever. And if some mid-level manager is reporting up the chain of command about, hey, there's a lot slipping through the cracks here. We should really do something about this. It's not that everybody is on red alert to go ahead and quickly revamp the organizational structure to deal with that because, hey, if there's a crash, not only do we feel bad that some people died, but, we're in trouble. We're going to be bankrupted. That's not how they think. That's not how it works. Okay. And so what if instead of that, you had a system that more heavily relied on the private sector? And so what might it look like? So here, I'm just throwing this out there. I'm not saying this is necessarily what it would look like, but just to give an example. So suppose there weren't an FAA, all right, but yet people still would want to travel. They would want to fly commercially. So what would happen? Well, people would still not want to die in plane crashes. And so besides the obvious check that, if one airline sort of gets a reputation that our planes aren't very safe and they have a bad publicized crash that's due to maintenance issues, that the public might shun that particular airline. Besides that ultimate check, there'd be a much more refined one, I think, where the airlines would have large insurance policies indemnifying either the survivors or like the estates of people that died in plane crashes. And so I think part of what would be standard in terms of when you're buying plane tickets is, there'd be a clause in the contract saying, yeah, if there's a crash, especially if it's determined that it's due to our negligence, then, we owe your estate $500,000 or whatever, making that number up. Right. So for a plane with 200 people on it, that's a huge potential liability. And so the insurance companies that are on the hook contractually for that, it would be in their interest to make sure that the planes, for an airline, that they're the ones, basically vouching for that airline, that those planes undergo routine maintenance. And they might also, have contracts with the airline saying, we have the right, we're going to send inspectors out, we might have spot checks. And we might just randomly show up. We're not going to tell you when. We're not going to give you a warning. And we're just going to randomly pull your pilots aside before they get on a plane and give them a sobriety check. Just to make sure your pilots are drunk. Stuff like that we have the right to do that because, we're potentially on the hook for billions of dollars if you had a bunch of plane crashes next week. And so to protect our investment and so forth, that's part of the deal. We're only going to agree to indemnify your customers with these insurance policies if we have the right to engage in these spot checks. And we'll look at the maintenance logs. We'll make sure that the wing flaps work and all that kind of stuff. But beyond that, yeah, we can check your pilots. We can also, have some look into the personnel decisions, all that kind of stuff. Right. So all the things that the FAA does now, I'm saying there could be private sector analogs of that, just worked out through voluntary negotiations between companies. And so the point is, would that system be flawless? No, there would still be plane crashes. But my point is, I think in that kind of a system, the incentives are much more conducive to everybody involved being very concerned about it. If there is a plane crash, then really analyzing what went wrong and trying to make sure that doesn't happen again. So with both systems, let me put it this way. What I think is unfair or is like, stacking the deck in favor of the government is if you say, oh, I think everybody working at the FAA and, in government regulation, they're noble-minded public servants and all they do every day is just worry about how can I protect the public. Whereas the people in this kind of a system that this guy Murphy just described, all they care about is money and, whether people live or die, it doesn't affect them emotionally. They don't care. They just want to maximize profits. And so I think that you're being, biased there. Like you have it be the same type of person in either system. And so if you think the people in the voluntary sector analog are really just going to care about the bottom line, that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. But then by the same token, the people who survive 20 years in government service and get promoted, become the head of the FAA or, become some high-level manager, I think also they need to know how the system works. That they need to know, oh, this certain senator, you make sure you kiss his butt and butter him up at cocktail parties and whatever, because it's, he's the person who has control over your budget or whatever. Okay. And like I say, as we've seen, when there's a crash that happens under the FAA's watch, their budget actually goes up. So if you think everyone's just motivated by money, then be consistent is my only point on that one. Okay. Also, just real quickly, and I'll move on because I want to get into some other topics here. When it comes to the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, so I've written a lot on this. The normal way free market economist types complain about the FAA is they'll say that it has very high regulatory hurdles in order for a company to bring a new drug to market. And so at this point, it's literally the case that a pharmaceutical company to bring a new major drug to market might have to spend more than $1 billion, so $1 billion with a B, dollars in research and development. And when you read statistics like that, like, oh, wow. But that's not because there's a bunch of scientists necessarily just sitting around, analyzing stuff under a microscope. It's that they have to do lots of tests and file a lot of paperwork, and there's like years long, like there's this kind of a study, there's the clinical study, then there's this, and there's just a lot of hoops they have to jump through before the FDA will sign off on something. And so for people who, maybe they have only got a few years left to live, and there's some experimental new drug, like this kind of stuff happens all the time. I'm not just like inventing some crazy scenario. And there's some new drug that's been approved in Europe for use over there, and they just want to be able to use it in the US because my doctor says I got 3 years left to live. I want to give this a shot. And it's illegal for them to do so. If their doctor prescribed it, they would lose their medical license, so on, right? And so there's actually some people that are advocating for it, and there may have even been recent changes in this. I haven't kept up with the literature on, well, can we carve out exceptions so that if it's like, a life-saving drug, and could there be reciprocity? So like if European regulators signed off on it, then, maybe here people could do it. There's things like that. But as a general rule, no, the FDA says what is legal or not, what is deemed unsafe, and you can't use it. Okay, so a lot of free market economists have focused on that element, and to say, hey, you're complaining about drug costs, right? Like politicians a lot of times rail against, look at how outrageously expensive this, cancer treatment drug is, or HIV therapy or whatever. And part of the reason is that, well, it has to be that expensive given our system. Because if you have to spend $1 billion in order to bring a new drug to market, you have to make your money back. You have to charge a lot in order to do it. And that's also why it's not profitable for the major pharmaceutical companies to develop treatments that cater to just like a small niche, right? Like if there's some disease that only affects 5,000 people in the US, it doesn't make any sense. It's not profitable to help them because, at best you'd be selling to a market of 5,000. Instead, something like erectile dysfunction has a much broader market. So that's why they focus on stuff like that. Okay, so that's part of the critique. But what I want to emphasize to you guys here is it's sins of omission and commission in the Vioxx scandal. So if that's not on your radar, the FDA approved Vioxx, and then it became clear that it was not safe, right? That they should not have approved it, given the system. And it took a long time for the FDA to eventually reverse themselves. And so a lot of people were harmed in the interim. And the argument is, if it were more of an openly competitive system, then probably, they wouldn't have dragged their feet that long. Right? So the allegation is, once the FDA approves something, if a bunch of people are dying using it, if the FDA then reverses itself, it's basically admitting, yeah, we screwed up, and those people that died, that was kind of on us. So they don't want to do that, right? Okay, so that's part of the critique. And so what would be the alternative? Like, geez, we're just going to have buyer beware, and everybody could just go online and do their research. And so for one thing is, well, if they're adults, that's actually not so crazy. That, yeah, if you're a good adult, you should, maybe some people would argue you have the legal right to put what you want in your body. But besides that, it wouldn't just be, hey, everyone do your own research and go to WebMD and figure out what you want to take. No, there could be private certification agencies, right? There could be. And so right now, for example, and I'll move on just because there's so much else I want to cover here with you guys. I think it's called Best Pills, Worst Pills is the name of it was like a monthly, I don't know if it was magazine's the right word, newsletter. It's probably the best term for it. And so they had a bunch of medical professionals who, I'm using the past tense because I don't know if it's still around, but it was in business at least for 10 years. And had a bunch of medical professionals who would independently assess the new drugs that were on the market to say to their readers whether they thought, this stuff is effective and or safe. I forget the numbers off the top of my head, but they did a review. I know an ER doctor who writes a lot of this stuff, and I co-wrote a book with him on this. And over a certain stretch, it was at least 10 years, but I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head. It was that every single example of when the FDA first approved a drug and then later changed its mind and said, no, actually, we're yanking it. It shouldn't be on the market. In every single example of when that happened, this private newsletter, Best Pills, Worst Pills, they beat the FDA to the punch. In other words, they said ahead of time, the FDA should not have approved this. We predict that eventually the FDA will yank this from the market. Okay, and my co-author went through and just documented how much lead time they had, right? So in some cases, it was like 6 months, but in other cases, it was years. Okay, so just to make sure you're getting the point, the idea being that these private experts who had a subscription-based service, right? So people would pay them whatever it was, $50 a month or something to get this newsletter, that they went out and did the research and they said ahead of time in every single case that, yep, the FDA is going to reverse itself. So there were 0 cases where the FDA had approved something and then yanked it and it caught the writers or the contributors to this digest by surprise. In every single case, they knew that was coming because they knew they shouldn't have approved this one. Okay, so that's just one example of the kind of thing I mean. And you could say, well, but gee, what if the people writing that newsletter are wrong or biased? What if they're getting paid off by some big drug company? Okay, well, then their track record would probably reflect that, and there could be competing, certification agencies out there. Okay, so that's, again, with all this stuff, the idea is with competition, you alleviate some of those problems. In other words, the problems you can come up with in terms of private competing ratings agencies, you don't magically fix that by saying, let's just have the government do it. Because, a politician doesn't know how to evaluate cancer drugs. So all they're going to have to do is defer it to somebody else too. But the problem is, if it's a political solution, then one group gets anointed as, okay, you guys are the experts, and then what if they're wrong or biased? The error correction mechanism is much more dubious in that setting. It's like, well, there could be an election in 2 years, and if enough people are mad, maybe, but that's not going to be a big issue. If it's just, the people using Vioxx or their family members are really mad, most people don't know what happened there. Okay, so private voluntary dispute resolution. I went over this last night. I'm going to go through it pretty fast here just to bring you guys up to speed if you didn't see the talk last night. So in general, how could we replace the government provision of like legal and court services and law enforcement and things like that? So I think both parties agree to an arbitrator or a judge. The judges, they only stay in business if they're fair. And the function of the judge is to render an opinion on how the law is applied to a set of facts in the case. And I think the rule of law will be upheld in this system. Okay, so this is the basic framework that I went through last night. But now in today's talk, I want to just talk a little bit more about like the technological implementation of this kind of a framework. One other set of points that we need to make to supplement it. So in that framework, I think insurance would play a role. Right now, consider medical malpractice and auto liability. So right now, if you go get surgery at a hospital and the doctor kills you, they have medical malpractice in place, right, for that sort of contingency. And so that's standard. You would have to have that in place. Or right now, if you want to drive on the road, it's mandated you have to have auto liability, that if you cause damage to somebody else, then you have insurance to indemnify that party. Okay, so that's not science fiction. That's how it is right now. And so I think in a voluntary private legal setting where, again, there's not the state rendering legal opinions, but it's just, hey, people have a dispute. They go to some reputable third party who renders an opinion. I think partly how that system kind of would work and function is the people interacting with each other could have insurance policies vouching for them. Okay, so I'm just mentioning the malpractice and the auto liability to show that this isn't completely new. I'm just saying if it works for medical malpractice and auto liability, you could extend that elsewhere. Okay, and so for example, if an employer is going to hire you and you're going to go to work 9 to 5, Monday through Friday at this big office building, I think one of the ways they could make that work is to say, all right, part of the contract is, you get your vacation days, how much we're going to pay you and so forth, how many sick days. And then if there's a dispute between us, whether it's over your contract or like if you assault a coworker or if you sexually harass somebody or, if you're caught stealing stuff from the storage room, so normally we would just call the police. We'd report a crime and the government would take care of it. It would get kicked into the government court system. But what if we don't have that? How could the free market handle it? I'm saying I think partly those standard employment contracts would contain clauses saying in the event of disputes like this, the matter would we agree we will go to some third-party arbitrator. And in order for that to have teeth, I think it would also, the employer would say, you need to get an insurance policy or have some fraternal organization vouching for you so that if you're convicted, like let's say, you assault a coworker and this disinterested third-party rules that you owe the coworker $200,000. Well, if you don't have that in your checking account, that's kind of useless. And so if you're carrying an insurance policy or that sort of contingency, well, then now that makes more sense. Okay? And so that's the kind of framework I talked about last night for those of you who were there. And so notice, that right off the bat, that builds in incentives for people to behave more responsibly. So just like if you're getting a lot of speeding tickets, your auto premiums go up. Or if you're a surgeon and you are, have a bunch of botched surgeries, your premiums go up and eventually you lose your job. Likewise here, if you're getting in bar fights all the time, well, then the premiums you would have to pay for your insurance policy that says if you're convicted of a violent crime, we agree we will pay the damages to your victims, as determined in a reputable arbitration proceeding, well, your premiums are going to go up. And so people are going to, that's going to be, it's not going to eliminate bar fights, but it will certainly put a penalty on it. Okay. So nobody's in a system, no one's forced to interact with anyone. It's ideal blend between safety and security. Okay. So in terms of the things, that I've been working on with my company and then, seeing other people in this industry, I think that just enhances the implementation of that framework that I just talked about, which, in the abstract might seem like science fiction. Okay. So right now, a lot of what's happening is the stuff we're working on is what's called tokenization of real world assets. And so I assume most of you are familiar with Bitcoin and blockchain, whether you actually know the actual mechanics of it and how does it work in terms of the cryptographics behind it. But just the general idea that, there's this thing called the blockchain that is this public ledger that anybody can download and they can see. And ultimately, you by some thing that you may or may not understand between like someone has private keys and there's a public key and you can digitally sign something and transfer it to somebody else, transfer Bitcoins to somebody else. And if we could all just sort of agree to use that as call it a store of value, if you will, then, that could be a neat little, payment system that's decentralized. And the beauty of blockchain, the promise of it is no one group is in charge of it. That's why they call it a trustless system that, if you have a bank or something and you want to send money to somebody, you have to trust the bank, right? That they're going to be competent and honest. That if you think you have $10,000 on deposit with them and they said, no, you don't, you only got $2,000, and it's just their word against yours, you're kind of out of luck, right? Whereas the beauty of a blockchain-based system is that all the transactions are up there for public viewing, and the way a transaction gets approved, it's again through like a decentralized process that I won't go into now, but I'm hoping some of you at least know the basics of that, or at least have heard people talk about it, and you understand that's why that's how it's supposed to work. That's the beauty of it. That's the appeal. Okay, so what I'm saying is, besides just the abstract, we can move Bitcoins around, now there's more of a push for sort of a hybrid where the tokens or the coins, if you will, that are getting moved around, it's not just the Bitcoin blockchain. There's all kinds of different blockchains that are being introduced that they sort of point to real world assets. And so, for example, instead of just being able to move Bitcoins around to different addresses, instead we can move some other coin around in a different, like say the provenance blockchain is one that businesses use. And, maybe what we take that to mean is that's showing who has title to, certain real estate holdings or what have you. Okay, so that's the idea. And so within that, one other element is on the Ethereum blockchain in particular, there's what's called the ability to have smart contracts. And so there, they can program in ahead of time. And again, it's all public record and people can see it, that you can specify conditions under which ownership of this contract will, change hands, or under these circumstances that are well-defined, certain events will occur that, maybe somebody posts some USDC, that's like tokens that are tied to the US dollar in a certain account. And then if these conditions are fulfilled, then boom, it gets activated and that USDC gets transferred over to this other account. So the idea is it's decentralizing the contracts and their enforcement. Okay, so if you were at the talk last night, you know that I spent a few minutes explaining, well, why do we need judges at all? Couldn't everything just be settled with contracts? And I pointed out that, well, no, even no matter how much ahead of time you try to anticipate every contingency, when people in the real world interact with each other, stuff is messy. And there are disputes that arise, even if both parties are acting in good faith or reasonably so. Everybody's typically biased, but even if both parties really do sincerely believe they're in the right, they can have a disagreement, that the contract is written in such a way that both parties think that, no, I'm owed such and such, and this other guy's trying to rip me off. And so that's why you still need judges. So even in this framework, but what I'm saying is that I think a large role in the near future we're going to see being filled by large language models. Okay, so like ChatGPT is the most famous, but just more generally, not just that particular model, but other ones. And so if you have, I'm sure some of you are very familiar with GPT like 4 and others maybe not so much. And I just want to say to you, regardless of what else you take away from this talk, if you have thought that these large language models are just kind of a fad or like a neat little parlor trick that isn't a big deal, I'm thinking you're underestimating it. Okay, and in particular, if all you've seen are people doing like one-shot prompts, or maybe you even played with it yourself 6 months ago and thought, oh yeah, that's kind of funny, and then you moved on with your life, it didn't think it was that big of a deal, I'm guessing you probably didn't take it in a certain direction. So the way that these things really shine and got me to take them seriously, that I think they're going to transform the economic world, is having a back and forth conversation with the thing where I'm trying to solve a problem and GPT-4 is helping me. And it's like if I had a grad student that knew a lot about economics and was very good at math. And we worked through a problem. And so, I toyed with just like showing you guys, but if you didn't know the context, it wouldn't really interest you and it wouldn't jump out at you. But I'm just saying, like, if you have, so don't go do something that your professors are going to get mad at. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying in general, if you had a problem that you were trying to work through and you're talking to the thing, it's amazing how it can help you brainstorm and solve a problem. Okay. And it's clear, even though if you know the architecture of these things and how under the hood, all it's doing is predicting the most likely next, they call it a token, but it's like a word, let's say, that's an approximation. Even though that's all it's really doing, it looks like you're talking to the thing. It feels like it's alive. I don't want to get into a metaphysical or philosophical discussion about is it alive or not. It doesn't matter. It behaves as if it is. And so what I'm saying is, I think businesses, I know certain businesses right now, I think more and more are going to start doing this, are brainstorming to realize that these things are like if we had a telecommuting worker, right? If we had somebody at an off location who was just coming in, sending data over the computer and doing work for us, that GPT-4 and other systems like it can now do a lot of those tasks. And so I think businesses are just rethinking, how can we work that into our workflow? Because there's a sense in which, if you run the numbers, and I've done calculations like this, it's basically just to motivate. It's like if you could hire up to 1,000 workers who have about 110 IQ for $1 an hour. And could you use that as a business? And if you're, a business where you're painting houses, no, not really, because the fact the computer can generate text doesn't really help you paint a house. But there's lots of businesses where you could use a lot of workers like that if they're that intelligent and that reliable. They don't need to sleep, and they cost you about $1 an hour. Okay, and again, depending on the numbers, that's kind of like what GPT-4 is. Okay, and it's just going to keep getting better. But even if it doesn't get better, even if it just plateaus with where it is right now, I think as businesses figure out ways to incorporate that, it's going to be as if certain pockets of the labor force went up by a factor of 30. Okay, and again, and people who are workers who are willing to work for very low wages is like economically what it's going to look like. So yes, it's going to disrupt certain sectors. If you're somebody who is a lawyer who makes wills right now and that's all you do, you're not going to be in business 5 years from now because the LLMs are just going to be able to do that so much more cheaply than you are. But in general, that's how innovation and progress works, that certain things get automated, then the humans have to go do something else where they have what's called the comparative advantage. Okay, so that's my spiel in general on LLMs. But back to this. So I think one obvious application is that what you'll end up seeing is, so the world will, you'll have a proliferation of these smart contracts where the assets are all, tied to various blockchains. So it's all decentralized. So you don't have to even trust the company that's administering it, right? It's all on blockchains. And they have all these agreements with each other about, oh, well, if this happens, then, money gets sent here and da-da-da-da. And then in cases where there's a genuine dispute and you need what's called an oracle, sorry, I'm just making sure I don't go over time here, then the bots, the AI-driven bots, could satisfy that at least as a first pass. And so notice, I think what you're going to see is that these large language models, you can train them to have localized, specific, domain-specific knowledge. All right, so just real quick example, with my company, Infineo, we have what we call informally AI Bob. All right, so my name's Robert, so I go by Bob. And that's trained on my writings on a certain type of life insurance policy that we specialize in. And so if people want to come to our website and learn about our products, we're getting very close to being able to just pop up, AI Bob shows up and you just talk to him, or even close to be able to you literally talk and it, synthesizes it and so forth. And then AI Bob can answer you, right? And so it's not, the way we do it is, you're under the hood, you've got these large language models that you can get, and then we augment it with the local domain-specific knowledge, and that's the way it works. We can talk more in the Q&A if you want about that. But my point is, so that is a large language model that's very specialized, and we've trained it with my, views on things. So it's like simulating what would I say in that setting. So if you have two Orthodox Jews and they have a dispute and they want to defer to a rabbi, instead of having to find a real rabbi who might, has an hourly rate and whatever that could be expected, here somebody could develop an AI rabbi system that studies and it could give pretty good responses based on the facts of the case. And so I'm just saying, if you haven't seen these things in practice, it might sound like this wouldn't work, but I'm saying it's remarkable how much they can talk and sound like they understand what you mean when you say things, even if you have grammatical errors, even if you, like one time I was talking to it and I said, oh yeah, that's kind of like what Aristotle did with his method of, asking questions, and it answered and said, oh yes, the Socratic method. And so notice, I said Aristotle, and I just screwed up. I meant Socrates, and it knew that. Okay, so I'm just saying these things are remarkably good at discerning what you mean. And so to be able to look at a contract that two people had, and now they're arguing over it, and then to say, what would somebody who adheres to this type of value system or ethical system or legal code think about this dispute? It will be very easy to mass produce AIs that for $1 render an opinion on something like that. And so I think that you're going to see this sort of thing sweep the world eventually. And then one last thing I'll do, and then I'll stop for your guys' questions. If we have, looks like we got about 7 minutes left. The particular type of insurance policy that we do at my company, I won't get into the nitty gritty of it, but the idea is it's a life insurance policy. It's called a whole life policy, and you pay a premium each month for a guaranteed death benefit, but the insurance company is investing those premiums, to buy assets. And then over time, you're sort of building up what's called a cash value. And so let's say the premium's $1 million. And so over time, you're paying the premiums and the cash value, maybe in the beginning is 1,000, then it gets to be 10,000, then it gets to be 20. And what happens is over time, given the premium payments you're making, the rate of growth of the cash value rises, partly because the value, what's called the value at risk, the gap between the death benefit and the premium shrinks each time. So under the hood, the insurance company, if you have $1 million death benefit, but you've got $200,000 in cash value, it's like they've got $200,000 in assets they're managing on your behalf. That's like backing up the policy. So there's only an $800,000 gap that's truly at risk that they have to insure against. Because if you die, they've already got the $200,000 that they're sort of administering. And so they're really only paying, you're only paying for the insurance on the $800,000. So that grows over time. And so I'm saying that type of framework, I'm realizing for a system like this, in order, you remember earlier I talked about having insurance policies that back up what you're doing. I think people could have all kinds of policies in place tailored to specific types of events like criminal liability for this type of thing, or, liability against my employer, or this and that and so forth. And they make the payments in the beginning, based on their risk characteristics. But if it's designed so that it accumulates value, then, that gap shrinks. And so it gets cheaper to keep those policies in force. And then if you never end up using it, right? So if you have a policy saying, hey, if I'm ever convicted of assaulting somebody, battery, then I've got this $1 million policy in place. Well, over the years, if that never gets invoked because you're a lawful, peaceful person, then it gets cheaper for you. Or what's the same thing, the payments you're making, the value, the cash value that grows. And then when you end up dying, let's say, you can just pass that on to your children, right? The cash there. So it's not like you've lost that ability. So anyway, I'll stop there, but I'm just showing the interaction of blockchain, smart contracts, and insurance and AIs that sort of render quick opinions based on the ethical or legal system that the two parties specify ahead of time, right? So there'd be dozens of different judge bots based on the individuals and their preferences. I think you're going to see the decentralization, a lot of outsourcing of traditionally state-provided services to the market. Okay, so I guess we got time for a few questions.
We got time for one question.
Okay, one question.
How long do you think it will be until these changes go into like a fuller effect where we start noticing the change?
Okay, so the question was how long before these changes start becoming apparent? So it depends on what specific element. So the tokenization stuff, that's already happening. I won't say, but there's like household name financial companies you guys have all heard of that are looking at, putting billions of dollars of worth of assets on various blockchains. If you guys can go look up, there's a thing called Figure, and that's HELOCs, if you know what a HELOC is. And that's all done on a blockchain, but the public doesn't even know that. Like they don't lead with that, but that just happens to be how it works. And the rationale is it eliminates a lot of the middlemen, right? So right now, if you want to get it's a home equity line of credit is what HELOC stands for. So the conventional way of doing that, there's like 5 or 6 intermediaries that have to sign off on it, whereas this process using Figure, it cuts out several of those steps. So that's why it's cheaper. So the public uses it just because it's cheaper. They don't care why it works. But strictly speaking, under the hood, there's a blockchain involved. Okay, so I think you're already seeing that, and that's just going to proliferate as people get more comfortable with it. Then the smart contract, that stuff, again, it's a little bit of a lag, but I think that's coming. Then the stuff about using AI systems to come in and sort of referee disputes, that is in my head right now, right? So that's, in fact, I'm going to send this talk to my coworkers and say, hey, this is an idea we should consider for next year. But so to answer your question there, that's probably more like 5 years, I think, before you would really see that taking off. But again, the technology is there. It's just getting the implementation. Okay, so am I wrapping up? Okay, thanks everybody.
This concludes another episode of InFi, the Future of Finance, with Dr. Robert Murphy. The information provided is for educational purposes and does not constitute financial advice. Consult with qualified professionals before making any financial or investment decisions. For more information on the host and for previous episodes, visit infi, thefutureoffinance.io. Thanks for listening.